Welcome to the World Deciphered, brought to you by the Cipher Brief. I'm your host, Iya Meurmishvili. This week we mark a somber anniversary, 1 year since Hamas broke through Israel's southern border and carried out a massacre. This anniversary not only commemorates the tragic loss of life, but also underscores the ongoing volatility in the region, with broader implications for Israel's security, as well as the potential for a wider regional conflict. To reflect on this, we will be speaking with Dov Zakheim, former Undersecretary of Defense, and a group of Cipher Brief experts who have devoted their careers to working on the issues of the Middle East.
7 October was the shocking day, but 9 October, Netanyahu laid out his plan. And he hasn't changed. So when people express surprise about next steps that have unfolded, I always tell them, go back to what he said on 9 October. He wasn't lying.
There will be huge pressure on both parties to stop it, because ultimately it's not in the world's interest, because of dependence on oil and gas, to have this kind of a war go on.
We'll get to that in a moment, but first our regular recap of the main news of the week from Managing Editor Tom Nagorski. Once again, nearly all major news come from the Middle East this week. Tom?
Thank you, Iya. It's hard to remember a more consequential week in the Middle East. The leader of Hezbollah killed in an Israeli airstrike. An Israeli ground invasion of Lebanon for the first time in nearly 2 decades, aimed at Hezbollah strongholds. And then a major retaliation from Iran in the form of missile strikes aimed at Israel. Now, at the end of this tumultuous week, the region and the world are waiting to see what Israel will do next. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has made it quite clear that there will be a powerful Israeli response. Iran made a big mistake, Netanyahu said, and it will pay for it. As experts from the Cipher Brief have told us this week, Israel has a long list of options to consider if it does strike Iran, including elements of Iran's nuclear program. And the regime in Tehran says it will hit back hard if it's attacked. So now the Middle East faces a new and large-scale war. One reflection of the enormity of the Middle East situation at the moment is that it has driven the war in Ukraine almost to the back burner. That was on Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's mind this week when he met with the new Secretary General of NATO. Zelensky noted the strong American support for Israel, and in particular, the help in defending against those Iranian missiles. Zelensky's argument: we need that kind of help too, when the Russian missiles are aimed at us. For the World Deciphered, I'm Tom Nagorski.
You probably already know that the Cipher Brief works with deeply experienced experts on global and national security to help put context around today's headlines. But did you also know that the Cipher Brief produces a daily report that keeps you up to speed on national and global security stories that are impacting businesses around the world? Like the President's Daily Brief, the Cipher Brief's open source report should be your first read of the day to stay ahead of the national and global security stories impacting your world. Become a subscriber and get the report for free. Subscribe at decipherbrief.com.
Before hearing the reflections on October 7th and the wars that followed, here is a brief reminder of that day and what has happened in a year since then. Once again, Tom Nagorski.
Almost no one saw it coming. Thousands of Hamas fighters broke through Israel's southern border in an early morning raid that became a long day of carnage and terror. When it was over, 1,200 people were dead, and the killers had taken 251 others back to Gaza as hostages. But in many ways, it wasn't over. As Israel mourned its dead, it also struck back. An aerial bombardment and then a ground war in Gaza, the goal to destroy Hamas and rescue those hostages. 1 year later, Hamas is a badly battered organization, and many of its leaders are dead. But the organization survives, and roughly 100 of the hostages are still believed to be in Gaza. Meanwhile, Israel's war has come at a staggering cost. 1 year later, more than 40,000 Palestinians have been killed, another 95,000 injured, and the Gaza Strip has seen its hospitals, housing, and food supply decimated. Another casualty of the war has been Israel's reputation on the world stage. The global sympathy that followed the October 7th massacre has eroded as the civilian toll in Gaza has soared. And 1 year later, Israel is fighting multiple wars now. The Gaza war still rages. Israel has launched an aerial and ground campaign against Hezbollah in Lebanon. In just 2 short weeks, Israel has killed the longtime leader of Hezbollah, along with several other senior figures, and struck significant military targets as well. And finally, another war looms, this one with Iran, the longtime patron of Hamas and Hezbollah. It's the regional conflict that the U.S. and others have feared since last October 7th, and it puts the region in truly uncharted territory. Last October, in the wake of the Hamas terror, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed to change the Middle East. 1 year later, Israel is fighting 2 and perhaps 3 wars. In this sense, Netanyahu was right. The Middle East may never be the same. For The World Deciphered, I'm Tom Nagorski.
We spoke with Dov Zakheim, a former Undersecretary of Defense who has worked on and written extensively about the Middle East. He says that while Israel has significantly weakened Hamas, there is a risk of escalation into a full-scale war between Israel and Iran, which would have serious global consequences. Dov, thank you very much for finding the time to talk to us today, and welcome to The World Deciphered.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Let's start from a general overview of what you think about this long and very turbulent year in the Middle East. October 7th marks the anniversary of Hamas attacks on Israel. So where do you see the region a year after those attacks?
Well, things have only gotten worse. On the one hand, I think the Israelis, at a very high civilian cost, quite frankly, have managed to really weaken Hamas. It's not even clear that their leader's still alive. He hasn't been heard from in a while. Hezbollah made what I think was a very serious error in entering this war, because it is a war, let's be honest, by firing missiles in support of Hamas. Now, they probably did that at Iran's request, because Hamas is an Iranian proxy, but Hezbollah is a much more important Iranian proxy. Simple reason being that, on the one hand, the Hezbollah people are Shia, Hamas is Sunni, and every once in a while I pick up these sort of rumors that the Hamas people resent the fact that Iran doesn't mind how many of them and how many Palestinians are being killed because they're Sunnis, whereas Iran really worries about the Hezbollah Shia. But it was a mistake for Hezbollah. And the reason it was a mistake was they didn't think about the fact that by displacing 70,000 Israelis, it was creating a situation that no Israeli prime minister, including, of course, Netanyahu, whose height was at the point after October 7th very unpopular, but no Israeli prime minister could sit back and do nothing. And so the Israelis have responded in a very, very serious way. It's the first time since 2006 that they've actually sent ground troops into Lebanon. Of course, they've killed Nasrallah. They've killed most of his leadership, and the explosions in the both the cell phones and the walkie-talkies is an act of intelligence brilliance that no one had ever thought of. And of course, now everybody's worrying much more about supply chains than they were before. And it's not clear how Hezbollah even communicates. So this war has widened. And I haven't even mentioned either the missiles that are fired by the Houthis and the Israelis' response there, or the missiles fired by Iranian proxies in Iraq, or the missiles fired by Iran itself. So we're looking at a very wide Middle East conflict right now.
Things are changing basically by the hour as we're monitoring the events. But to again look back at this past year, what do you think some of the lessons are from since October 7th?
Well, there are different lessons for different players. For the Israelis, clearly October 7th was an intelligence disaster. And it turns out that because there were these young women soldiers who were informing their superiors that something was going on the Hamas side of the border, and the only thing I can say is that the Israeli military is still riddled with male chauvinism, and they ignored the warnings. So one major lesson was don't ignore the warnings, no matter who they come from. Secondly, unlike the wall that divides the West Bank from Israel proper, or at least most of the West Bank, because some of the West Bank is actually inside that wall as well, there was a fence along a good part of the border with Gaza. And it was very, very easy to bulldoze the fence. So another lesson, and there will be many because there still hasn't been a full investigation, but another lesson clearly is they have to monitor that border as effectively and efficiently and with some kind of a wall as they do in the West Bank, which by and large, even with isolated incidents, and there have been incidents, has been relatively protective of the Israeli population. So that's a major lesson too. And then a third lesson, and this is my personal view, is that if Israel was prepared to trade 1,000 Palestinians, including Sinwar, by the way, for one soldier, they should have been much more willing to negotiate a trade for the hostages in exchange for a ceasefire. After all said and done, the Israelis could have picked up the war where they left off once they had the hostages. They haven't done that. And at least half the hostages are now dead. Most people think maybe more. Some people think they're all dead. Who knows? And that's another lesson. Maybe you don't want to trade 1,000 terrorists for one person in the first place. But if you do, you've set a precedent. And then it's kind of hard to wiggle out of it.
Let's look at the operation in Gaza. What's your assessment of that? Do you think it was successful? Do you think it's still going on successfully? And to, again, look back at October 8th of last year, everybody was very sympathetic, of course, to Israel and very supportive. And a year later, the situation has changed, and many are criticizing Israel for its operation in Gaza. So, what's your assessment on it? What's changed, and why do you think we're seeing this criticism?
Well, it's what I just mentioned. The fact that Netanyahu, under pressure from his extreme right wingers, and maybe he sympathizes with them, it's more and more evident that he does. But Netanyahu simply refused to negotiate a hostage for ceasefire. And by the very nature of what Hamas and actually Hezbollah as well do, they hide inside civilian structures. They hide inside hospitals, inside schools, inside mosques. Once the Israelis made the decision to go after Hamas, there was going to be huge collateral damage. In other words, that's a military word for killing innocent people, quite frankly. We don't, in a sense, it doesn't matter whether it's 40,000 or 30,000, whether it's 10,000 children or 5,000 children. The numbers are huge. And so the Israelis have slowly been losing international support from countries that have always been friendly to them, because they simply have shown no inclination, and this isn't the Israelis, this because there have been huge demonstrations to get the hostages released and for a ceasefire. This is Mr. Netanyahu and his right wing, who simply have refused to listen to Israel's friends. And so that has been a major ramification since October 7th, and I think explains why so much of the world is quite negative about Israel's operations in Gaza. Now, the one other thing I would add is because Israel is increasingly isolated, that has given Netanyahu an excuse. He might as well go after Hezbollah as well, because what are they going to do more than they're already doing? I mean, the ICC, the International Criminal Court's already thinking about calling him a war criminal. Countries are already isolating Israel. Businesses, the economy is hurting. So his attitude may well be, I might as well go for broke, which is what he seems to be doing.
So where do you think this will go then?
Well,
how do you think this ends?
It depends which of these confrontations you're talking about. If you're talking about Gaza, he's already weakened Hamas very, very seriously. The long-term problem, of course, is that if you kill someone, that person has family, has friends, whether it's siblings, cousins, uncles, aunts, who are going to be very bitter. And the only way around that is, frankly, to give the Palestinians a state. Without a state, there's absolutely no reason for these people who are bitter, who've lost family, to think other than they're thinking right now, which is they hate the Israelis. Where Hezbollah goes is an interesting question because, after all said and done, they're only one group within Lebanon. Lebanon, historically and until today, is a mix of Maronite Christians, Orthodox Christians, Druze, Sunnis, as well as Shia. And Hezbollah has been resented by all these other groups, including some of the Shia as well. So where Hezbollah goes from here on out is a very interesting question.
So you're not excluding a possibility of a wider war in the region?
You can't possibly exclude it. I mean, the Iranians have just attacked Israel for a second time. The Israelis have vowed revenge. And even if they do something initially, that doesn't mean they won't do anything more. If they do anything, how will the Iranians have already said that what the Israelis will do, they will respond as well. So you've got these threats and counter threats. How can you possibly say that the war will not get worse when you're hearing this from both Tel Aviv or Jerusalem and Tehran?
Yeah. And what do you think the U.S.'s reaction or involvement should be or could be in this conflict if it escalates any further?
Well, the administration is committed to defending Israel, so that clearly, however many missiles are fired, we will defend the Israelis. We'll shoot them down. We're not the only ones. Apparently, the British were involved. Apparently, the Jordanians were involved. Indeed, a Jordanian was hurt by shrapnel. So defensively, we'll be there with the Israelis. The question is offensively. Netanyahu would like to drag us in offensively. My guess is we'll be very reluctant to do so. That's not what we don't want to get into a war with Iran. We will defend Israel against Iran, as we have, but we're not going to get into a war with them. I don't think anybody in America wants to.
Dov, let me ask you the final question.
Sure.
So we've been talking about this past year and how turbulent and devastating for the region it's been and difficult for Israel. How do you think this ends? Do you think a year from now we'll be talking about 2 years of this war now?
I have my doubts. For a start, even if this escalates, there will be tremendous pressure on. Escalation means Iran versus Israel. That's what escalation means. Let me be clear. There will be huge pressure on both parties to stop it, because ultimately it's not in the world's interest, because of dependence on oil and gas, to have this kind of a war go on. I mean, we're not talking about some small proxy war here. We're talking about the two strongest powers in the region at each other's throats. I just don't think that can go on. And as I said, there's a case for Iranian caution. There are limits to what the United States will do for Israel. And so there are factors here that I think will limit just how far this can go. So in a year's time, inshallah, in a year's time, let's hope that things will have quieted down.
Just a very small follow-up to that. Do you think the U.S. elections in November will impact that in any way?
Up to a point, yes. It's not at all clear that Mr. Trump would hold back offensively. We just don't know. Mr. Trump is so inconsistent. There are other words, stronger words that people use, but I'll just use inconsistent, that we just don't know how he'll react on the day. That, of course, he has argued, as has Mr. Vance, that it's precisely because people don't know that they're deterred. Who knows? But we just don't know. In the case of if Ms. Harris, Vice President Harris, is elected, the Democrats have made it clear, and I think Mr. Waltz made it clear again in the debate, the vice presidential debate, that America will defend Israel, but it's clear that it will not go on the offensive with Israel. Mm-hmm. So the only question about offensive American support is if Trump is president.
Well, thank you very much for this insight and your thoughts. I appreciate your time.
Well, thank you for having me.
Here at the Cipher Brief, we have no shortage of experts on the Middle East. People who served as diplomats, intelligence officers, and in other capacities in the region. This week we turn to 4 of them. Ambassador Gary Grappo, a longtime diplomat with multiple postings in the Middle East, and Paula Doyle, Glenn Korn, and Ralph Goff, all with long careers at high levels of the CIA and a deep experience in the Middle East. We asked them to reflect on the lessons and key takeaways of the year since October 7th, 2023 attacks.
So the main reflections are, I really believe it's important for listeners to go back to 9 October. 7 October was the shocking day, but 9 October, Netanyahu laid out his plan. And he hasn't changed. So when people express surprise about next steps and next steps and next steps that have unfolded, I always tell them, go back to what he said on 9 October. He wasn't lying. He plans to change the Middle East. This is what he is doing. And by going after Hamas in the south and in Gaza, as well as the West Bank, and there was that foray into Iran, I think that sends a message to Hamas that Israel is watching where they are and has, at times, the capability and capacity to reach into other nations and do what they feel they need to do. This is going to cause all kinds of disruptions if he goes after Hamas personnel in Europe, I think. But, he's been very bold and brazen and honest about the goal. In the case of Hezbollah, this has been ongoing with Israel since the 80s. For me, the 9 October statement was directed at multiple people. It wasn't just directed at Hamas. It was directed at Hezbollah. It was directed at the Houthis, and it was super directed at Iran.
First, it's worthy to note that, or it's worthwhile to note that there has not yet been a full accounting on the part of Israel on how it could have been caught the way it was, so unable to defend its residents in southern Israel when it was attacked by the Hamas forces. Particularly when the Hamas attack, it was clearly thought out in its initial phases, but then it seemed pretty random, and but nevertheless effective because Israel was so unprepared for it. And so at some point, obviously, there will have to be a full accounting. We have not seen it yet. I know Netanyahu has not accepted responsibility for it and has actually blamed his military commanders and probably some of his intelligence folks as well. And that needs to be thoroughly investigated. That's point number one. Point number two, I certainly didn't envisage the level of devastation we've seen in Gaza. Clearly, we were going to see something on a scale much, much greater than any of the other confrontations we've witnessed between Israel and Hamas over the last 12 or 15 years. But this is orders of magnitude greater, imposing extraordinary levels of suffering, of course, on the people of Gaza, but also beyond the 1,200 Israelis who were killed in the attack, many Israelis too, because huge numbers, tens of thousands of Israeli residents in the south and subsequently in the north were forced to evacuate their homes. In the south for obvious reasons, but in the north because Hezbollah, within days of the October 7th attack, began pretty much daily rocket attacks on northern Israel. So you have a number of internally displaced people. I say a number, we're probably talking on the order of today about 100,000. Mm-hmm. Now, most of those are folks previously residing in the north. A number of the folks in the south have been able to return to whatever may be left of their homes.
One of the things that really has struck me, and it's been painful to watch is the level of anti-Semitism in this country, which has bubbled to the surface. I think we have a very serious problem. I think many Jews would say that they've known that existed for a while, but I in my life, I've never seen it so bad in this country. Jewish hate crimes are up across the country. I don't have the statistic with me, but I just read that yesterday, FBI crime statistics. Some of the protests that we've had in the country have been very scary for me.
You know, I used to have two rules when I worked in the Middle East. One was when dealing with our various partners, never take it personal, right? And never be surprised. Because whether you're talking about the Saudis or talking about the Israelis or anyone, right, in that part of the world, countries follow their national interests. And so, everything we've seen happening out there have been these different players following what they perceive to be their own national interests. I mean, yeah, we could say we were surprised that the Israelis hit a diplomatic facility in Syria when they took out the IRGC targets, right? We could say we were surprised by the Patriot attack, but those things were interesting, but not really surprising because Mossad in particular has a very deep bag of tricks there, right? And you look at, I think the only thing that surprised me was the restraint to the Iranians after the hit on their people in Syria when they telegraphed their rocket, missile, and drone attack on Israel. I was really surprised at the lengths to which they went to telegraph that strike. And then, but what didn't surprise me was how that strike failed utterly because of the robust defensive capabilities of Israel, particularly when used in conjunction with the allies like the United States and some help from Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. So I can't say there's been a lot of surprises. It's just been a year of almost like one-upsmanship from one side or the other.
Israel is certainly winning this war to the extent that you can say that. That is, that they are slowly but surely whittling down the fighting capability of Hamas. They have dealt a huge blow to its ability to carry out coordinated attacks throughout Gaza against Israeli troops. They probably have depleted their ammunition and rocket stocks considerably. I know the number of rocket attacks emanating from Gaza on some days is zero, and on others just a handful. So they have probably eliminated as much as 60% of the fighting forces of Hamas, including a significant number of the Nakhba brigade, which is the special operation forces. So Israel is winning the military war. On the other hand, the sort of PR war, Israel is suffering huge losses worldwide. Basically, with the exception of the United States, the world, and a few countries in Europe, is categorically opposed to what Israel is doing now in Gaza. And there's not much chance of persuading them otherwise. Mm-hmm. And the knockoff of that, given our support for Israel, is that we are suffering too, in terms of our influence and image around the world. So it's something that the United States cannot afford either. Be that as it may, it seems as though Israel is intent on pursuing the war in Gaza, assuming it doesn't get so distracted in Lebanon that it has to throw everything it has against Hezbollah there.
Israel spent, in my view, they struggled with the fact that Hamas was hiding in hospitals and schools and in civilian populations. And so they made their objective the elimination of Hamas at all cost. And that came at a cost. That came at a huge cost. Because the rules of warfare don't like attacking non-combatants. The rules of warfare don't permit it in a civilized world. And so they've got a lot of work to do. But the main thing Israel can do is get back to a two-state solution. I cannot imagine a peace process without a two-state solution. I cannot imagine a peace process where Israel takes over all of the Palestinian Authority territories and says, that's okay, we got you covered. We'll take care of you. I cannot imagine that future. And unless and until Israel comes forward and says, we're back at the table for a two-state solution, here's what we would like, they will struggle. They will struggle in the court of world opinion.
Unfortunately, I think it's, nobody can say that this problem's going to go away. What I'm watching now in Lebanon is if the Israelis continue to take apart Hezbollah the way that they've been doing, what comes next? What's going to fill the void? Nature abhors a vacuum. Lebanon has always been an unstable, or its history, a very unstable place. We shouldn't forget that before Hezbollah, we had the PLO operating at a Lebanese territory, striking Israel. So we have to look at, and there are a lot of players in Lebanon and in the Levant that want to take their licks on Hezbollah. They're not fans. They've been bullied and threatened and terrorized by Hezbollah. And so I think there's going to be competition to fill that vacuum. This is why that I hope that the security assistance that we have given to the Lebanese government, and especially the Lebanese armed forces, will pay off, and that the Lebanese armed forces can seize control of their territory and bring some order and stop that vacuum from being filled by groups like ISIS, maybe other Palestinian radical groups, extremist groups. You can go down the list of all the players that are probably trying to get in there.
For months, that was the criticism of Israeli actions in Gaza, that there was no plan for governance afterwards, right? And then, now there's like, what's the plan for the West Bank? What's the plan for cooling things down there? Right? The West Bank has been kind of shoved into the off the front pages as well. And I've always been consistent in believing that the West Bank is actually the key to a lot of this stuff. That the worse that things get in the West Bank, the more that negatively impacts Gaza and Lebanon and Iran, right? So there's kind of it's a mystery as to where the Netanyahu government intends to go following any kind of ceasefire in the north, following any kind of ceasefire in Gaza, and then, of course, they have to deal with the fallout from both those struggles.
There is no vision for Gaza, none whatsoever. There's no vision for the West Bank other than Netanyahu digging in his heels even further by insisting there will be no Palestinian state, which is bollocksing up this whole effort, because were he to change his position, I think it would change the outlook of many, certainly Arab countries, but also the rest of the world with respect to Israel. But under Netanyahu, that does not seem to be a possibility. But what he has in lieu of that so far has eluded me. And in fact, I don't think he has one.
The only thing that's going to be hopeful here is space that is declared as safe enough, and a willingness to come to the table and do get right back to true peace talks. I just don't see any other way forward. We could just do war for the rest of our lives, and I really don't think that's the right answer.
As we reflect on this turbulent year, one thing is clear. Without the path to peace, the cycle of conflict will continue to cost lives, further destabilize the region, and impact the world for years to come. And that's it for this episode of The World Deciphered. I'm your host, Iya Meurmishvili. Remember, you can watch the full interviews with each of our guests on the Cipher Brief's YouTube channel, and visit us at decipherbrief.com, where you can subscribe to our open source report, keeping you up to speed on what's happening in the world every Monday through Friday. And remember, national security is everyone's business. See you next week.